Yes, with pleasure. The term itself has become fashionable over the last decade or so, and it's been used in rather different ways. It was even used by the Bush administration to complain about people using the law in this country against the war effort in Iraq and of course, in what was called the war against terror. My wife and I, in a book called Law and Disorder in the Post-Colony, you first introduced it into our domain of scholarship about 10 years ago or so. And what we meant very strictly by it was the use of law and the violence inherent in the law for political ends. Often by deploying the instruments of the law in order to do things that one ought to do politically, but for one or another reason choose not to. In that sense, lawfare is most classically used by the powerful against the weak, used by states against political enemies, used by not only the state, but used by corporations against people who get in the way of enterprises and so on. It also has the obverse, what we call insurgent lawfare, which is lawfare used by the weak against powerful organizations, states, etc. For example, against Shell Oil in Nigeria, local populations in Igbo land mobilized as much of the law as they could to have Shell take account for its cooperation with the then Nigerian regime in killing Igbo in order to gain control over land and so on. So lawfare can be used two ways. Strictly speaking, when one talks about the use of lawfare, i.e. the use of the violence of the law, the analogy is, of course, with warfare. And warfare, and this goes back, of course, to Clausewitz and the great theorists of war, always has to it three dimensions. And those three dimensions are characteristic of lawfare in the contemporary age. The first is the question of geography. Where are wars fought? After all, wars aren't simply fought without any consideration of the landscapes on which they occur. Armies seek heights, they use the sea, they engage, as it were, in the strategic use of cartography, of the landscape, of geography. Well, the equivalent in law, of course, is jurisdiction. After all, where you fight a law case is foundational to winning or losing it. And in fact, that's of course what lawyers do. Expert lawyers are very careful about jurisdiction shopping, as it's called, and so on. So that if in South America you're going to fight a human rights case, as for example the Tingni Indians did against the Nicaraguan government, they found it entirely inappropriate to try this in Nicaragua, so they went to the Inter-American Court. Similarly, if one recalls the prosecution of Pinochet, it started in the British courts, it moved to the Spanish courts, and then it did because those were the geographies in which he could be brought to justice, when he clearly couldn't in the first instance in Chile itself. Jurisdictions are very complex, of course. Many cases are fought under the Alien Torts Act in the US against American acts of violence against local populations in the courts of Manhattan or various, so that the victims of apartheid in South Africa took their case to the Manhattan courts, where it's had, in fact, a very tricky history. So jurisdiction is the first dimension, geography, in other words. The second dimension of war is weaponry. And weaponry in the law, of course, is jurisprudence. What laws you use to fight. So that, for example, in America, insurgent lawfare can't use, for example, human rights law, because the courts basically don't recognize it. So while human rights might make a moral claim, it's very weak law. In this country, much harder law. Tort law, any kind of damages, of course, war crimes and other, that's much harder law. So, in effect, deciding how you fight and how people use the law, and of course, what states typically use against their enemies, or at least what people who rule in the name of the state, because state's an abstraction. States don't fight, people fight. So what people with power tend to use, of course, is corruption, because basically so much can be defined as corruption, so much is inchoate. We've reached the age in which the line between the legal and the illegal is inherently inchoate. And in fact, power, especially the power of authority, i.e. authorized power, is often lies in the capacity to draw the line, to decide what is legal or what is illegal. And very often as we see this now in the American election, Trump basically threatening to, trying to delegitimize his opponent by calling her Crooked Hillary, by saying that the reason that she cannot be his just opponent is because she's a criminal. Never proven. In fact, quite the opposite. Where there was the possibility of indicting her, the FBI decided not to. That hasn't stopped Trump. And what Trump has in fact said is, the moment I become president, she becomes a criminal.
Yeah.
Okay, so ex post facto, what is now perfectly legal, maybe ill-advised, would, in that political context, with a seizure of authority by God forbid, a Trump administration, would be the criminalization of a political enemy. And that, of course, has happened a lot. And in a way, once upon a time, political opponents were killed by fascist. Now they're basically incarcerated, and the violence of the law has replaced the violence of the gun, because you destroy people, you face them, you erase them, you take away their assets, you take away their dignity, you take away their lifestyle. And that's, by the way, and I'll come back to the third dimension of the law and of lawfare in a moment, that is the difference between rule of law and rule by law. Rule by law is the use of jurisprudence to attack one's enemies and to control one's enemies, to control populations. We do it here all the time. The criminalization of black populations, of poor populations, is also the use of lawfare to, in effect, make a class that no longer can work because the American economy doesn't have work anymore for the vast majority of its population, for dealing and managing basically black poor people, people who were once upon a time proletarians and now have become criminalized, which is why America has the largest carceral rate in the world. Ironically, America calls its unemployment rate 7%, or now 5.7%, but it doesn't count people in prison, which is basically almost 3 million people. It doesn't count people who have stopped looking for work. So its real rate is somewhere in the high 20%, which is in effect very much like the global south, which is supposed to be the land of the poor, etc., etc. And what is more, America counts jobs, it doesn't count incomes. This is a country in which, in fact, if you are a minimum wage worker in New York, and you're, say, a 50-year-old woman, you need 1.8, 1.9 jobs in order to have an income above the poverty line, which means that if America actually ever were to have full employment, it would have to have 100 and something percent, because a job isn't an income. But that's a side point. The third dimension of lawfare is what one would think of as externalities. That is to say, the environment that is created in order to use the weaponry of the law against your opponents. And these classically these days are the media capture, also sometimes, of course, corporate capture of the state itself, which often is one of the deepest collaborations of all. Of course, state and capital basically using the law together, which means using the media, capturing the media. After all, we have no neutral media. In this country, Trump is complaining constantly about the liberal media. Of course, he's paying no attention to the fact that wherever you go, Fox News, what calls itself Fox News, is basically the mouthpiece of the right. It doesn't have any news. It only has opinion, which it calls news. I believe Brazil is very, very similar, where in effect the media tend to be stacked very much in one direction. It happens in many contexts. It means that there are very few even playing fields. But the way in which protagonists in lawfare capture the digital media, capture the street, which is very important in some parts of the world, how you incite people to go into the street to create a mood of guilt around somebody that you're attacking, all of those things are part of the externalities of lawfare. In other words, this triple dimension is the way in which, in effect, the law is mobilized. And I use the term the violence of the law very purposefully. In the 1920s, Walter Benjamin, the German theorist, wrote a very important essay called Critique of Violence. It's known to every scholar, right? In which he makes the point that the law is inherently violent. Why is the law inherently violent? Because there is a huge difference between lawmaking and the implementation of the law. Much of policing, much of the power given to prosecutors turns out not to be about the originary application of the law. It tends to be about lawmaking in the absences, where law actually has what critical theorists call aporias, spaces, vacuums, because the law always has vacuums, and those get filled by political technologies and various other ways of controlling the space in which people are judged. Now, of course, I talked about the rule of law and rule by law. This is the critical distinction between democracies and autocracies. You won't call autocracies fascist, they tend in that direction. And also new forms of populism, because the tendency, in effect, to set aside equality before the law. There's the notion that you judge people before they ever reach a court is rule by law. It is characteristic of autocracies, not of democracies. And if you read Brazil from Harvard, right? If you read, for example, the submission that has been placed in front of the United Nations, this is the junction in the road that Brazil seems just to have taken, to have moved from rule of law to rule by law. After all, Lula, others clearly are being judged before a trial, and nobody. That's deeply offensive, by the way, to any American sensibility. Say to anybody at Harvard, somebody should be judged guilty before they have a court hearing, and the media signs up fascism, and this is exactly what we're trying to avoid in a Trump administration. That is why the issue of Trump is as much about the Supreme Court and as much about the law and its misuse, which he promises us. He promises us the misuse of the law in terms of some kind of inchoate good. And what is that good? We don't know. It's his idea of order, and that tends to lead to spaces of populism, of the making of heroes who become, as it were, cavalier guardians of the law in the face of the public, but in effect to violate the law themselves in order to essentially pretend to, and I use the word pretend because it is a pretense, pretend to be protecting some kind of public good, when actually what is at issue is private gain, private glory, private heroism. Those are very dangerous principles. And as I say, we see it here in front of us. Alas, we see it in South Africa, we see it in India, we see it in Britain, and I hate to say it, but from here we've seen it in Brazil as well. I would never judge the rights and wrongs of a Brazilian court. I don't know who might be guilty of corruption, who might not be guilty of corruption, but I do know one thing, and that is that until that is established in a court with no prior prejudice, because everything that comes before, every sort of street demonstration, every interview by a prosecutor to a newspaper is basically a prejudgment. And it basically is precisely the third dimension of law. It's creating externalities. It's creating a mood of guilt before it. That's illegal. I mean, that is flatly, under American law, that's incitement, which is a criminal act, right? That is perversion of the law. It even is, in a sense, a form of perjury, because one is saying to a public something that cannot be established as a truth. And what one is doing with that is actually saying to a public, this is going to be of value and of authority in a law case before it's happened. If anything is a perversion of the law, that's it. And if I were ordinary Brazilians, I'd be very worried about this. Again, I'm not a Brazilian. I have no stakes in this situation. But from a South African perspective, and from a perspective of having myself been deeply engaged in the fight against apartheid and the fight against autocracy, I would be scared. Because the moment you go down this route, you're in deep trouble. That's why all of us sitting here are deeply afraid of the Trump phenomenon. Not simply because it's Trump, but it promises the fact that some 30 or so million Americans actually want to transform this country into an autocracy, and want to suspend the law, and want again to move from rule of law to rule by law. One hopes, in effect, that both the Brazilian population and the American population see the dangers, because that writing on the wall leads to a lot of people, leads to basically everybody being insecure. After all, what happens if a prosecutor decides he wants to come after you tomorrow? After all, what happens if he decides he'll tap your phone? After all, if he's done it to one other person, he can do it to you. If he can leak the records to a medium, he can leak your records to a medium. Which one of us would prefer to do that? And of course, one thing about understanding the dangers of the law, this is what we learned in South Africa, where the security cops used the law bitterly against all of us, right? Was the moment they do it to one person, it is a threat to everybody. And we think of these things as abstract, but sometimes a thought experiment is worthwhile in the face of lawfare. Is what happens if the law decides to look at you for any number of reasons, and there are always reasons, right? Somebody has sights on the place you live. This happens a lot, eminent domain, let's get rid of properties here because a corporation wants to build a factory or whatever. And they want to use the law to get rid of you. We're all, in fact, vulnerable. This is why the stakes of rule by law are so high. They seem abstract when they involve some corrupt CEO or a head of state that a current regime wants to get rid of and wants to subdue. That all seems abstract. But the way of understanding that abstraction is saying, well, what happens if somebody wants to take a look at my taxes and decides to tap my phone and decides to look into my life? After all, the law is, as I said, it's inchoate. Cops here use the law in the most bizarre ways to get at people like they want to get. Now, this is not to say that all policing is bad, all courts are bad. Quite the opposite. That isn't the case. And one hopes that human decency, in Brazil as everywhere else, protects against this. But the thought experiment always is, what in extremis if I become a victim of lawfare? And believe me, I actually have in South Africa, and it's terrifying. And I hadn't done anything. I wasn't dangerous. I wasn't any big hero, big player. Once the law comes after you, its violence is deadly.
And do you believe Lula is victim of lawfare?
Well, from everything I see, yeah, absolutely. Now, of course, I'm not living in Brazil. I've read the papers, read the records, looked at some of the leaks. Well, I can tell you, as I said before, the very fact that his communications were tapped, that his communications with his lawyers were tapped, that these were leaked to public. In fact, if I were Lula, I'd be suing the prosecutor, and if Brazil has a decent civil legal system, they would have to entertain that. After all, that is an invasion of privacy. That's illegal. Tapping is illegal. And certainly tapping is illegal. So basically, he is the subject of a series of criminal actions which do exactly the three things. They seize a geography, they seize a jurisprudence, and they seize public opinion. From what I see, it seems to me, and I've read through the documents on the question of who owned what properties, and those things, they are so far from justiciable in any reasonable legal. I haven't seen anything that I could see as really going before and convincing a court of its facticity. I see a lot of rumor, a lot of circumstantial evidence, which has absolutely no value in civilized courts anywhere, unless there is a huge burden of proof. And I see rumors. I see unnamed rumors. I see basically what we tend to hear called garbage law. Basically the stuff you fill a case with when you don't have a case. But do I see any real evidence? Not yet. And if there is, I'd like to see it. I mean, I'm not judging whether Lula is guilty or innocent. But if you say to me on the evidence of what is out in the public domain, provided illegally, I should say, by the prosecution, there's nothing there. There's no more there than there is against Hillary Clinton and the FBI, which after all has declared her innocent. If you ask me, has Lula been the victim of a crime? Very definitely. If you ask me if Lula has the right to a case, that is exactly what I would want. I mean, put him, give him a just trial, right? Yeah. Hear the evidence, hear the count, but don't put garbage law in front of a court. I mean, it makes a fool of the prosecution. And frankly, right now, from here, sitting in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the prosecution looks foolish. I'm prepared to change my mind if I can be convinced that way. It takes the same hard-ass attitude toward all law. That's true of prosecutors here as well. There's a lot of garbage that comes before the law. Prosecutors often have heroic self-images. One has to say that the law produces a lot of narcissism in litigators. We all know that. But if there's hard law, cool. Okay, show it to me. I'm happy to entertain it. But don't fill my inbox with garbage. And certainly if it were an American judge sitting on this case, don't fill her or his court with garbage either, because not only would you be made a fool of, but you'd be dismissed basically as using the law in the mode of a lawfare. So no, I don't see any evidence. But that's not to say, I'm not saying there isn't evidence. I'm being very careful here. What I'm objecting to is trial by public, trial by newspaper, trial by rumor, trial by leakage, all of the things that actually break the law, not make the law or not enforce the law. Lula, everybody else, deserves their day in court, but remember, the first principle of a civilized legal regime is equality before the law. That means that the defense has the same rights as a prosecutor. That means that a judge is impartial. That means that judges have no right to judge their own impartiality, nor their own role in the judicial process. Any judge that judges his or her own conflict of interest is in a double conflict of interest. And that seems to me to lurk in this case. Again, I'm not passing judgment, I'm reading from the record that's out there, but it seems to me that the judge has had deep conflict of interest, that the prosecutor has far exceeded their authority, and that until such time as we can be shown that rumor is hard law, it is not in the slightest bit convincing. At least that's my reading from here and from now. As I say, I'm perfectly happy to be convinced in either direction.
Okay, John. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.